Welcome to this beginning Adobe Illustrator tutorial on how to make a fun skull. So we are going to be learning a lot of simple shape and drawing techniques today that are going to allow you to blend shapes and make something that has a little bit of a three-dimensional shading to it as well. So let's go ahead and get started. We're just starting with a letter size document. So when you're making your document, make sure that you set it to print and then choose the preset for letter. That should be CMYK and 300 ppi. Now we're going to start out by drawing with our shapes. So our shapes are over here in our toolbar, and you might see that your shape is set to any one of these presets, but we want the ellipse tool. So as you're selecting, make sure that you click on there and then choose ellipse. With every shape, you have the option of setting a stroke, and that's the outline of your shape, and the fill, which is the interior color of your shape. Now for this shape, we do not want a stroke. So if you look up here at the options menu at the top, you can see this little kind of square donut is always the stroke. You can see that also down here. And then the just solid color is the fill. So if we click on the stroke and set it to this red slash, we know that we don't have a stroke set currently, which is what we want. If we click on the fill, we're going to set it to kind of a medium light gray. So either one of these grays right here would be just fine. And since we're in the ellipse, we're drawing a perfect circle here by holding down the shift key as we click and drag. And if you also hold down the option key, you can pull that from the center. If you don't do that, that's okay though. You can just move it back to the center with your selection tool. After you're done with that, you're going to go back into that shape tool and then select rounded rectangle. And with your rounded rectangle, you're going to draw the jawline of your skull a little bit overlapping your circle. So I'm just going to do it like that. You can hit V or click on your selection tool, hold the shift key down, and select both of those shapes. And actually, before I do that, I'm going to move this just a little. I'm going to move it to the side so you can see what I'll be doing here, and move it up a little bit too. So then I'm going to hold the shift key down and select both of those. Then I'm going to go to the top here, and I want those to be aligned with each other, so I'm going to click on Horizontal Align Center. That's looking pretty good. Now before you click on anything else, we're going to do something that's going to then blend these shapes together. If you do not like how this is looking in terms of the proportion to each other, you might want to change that up before you get to this next step, and then you would just select these both again. We are going to use something called the blend tool, and that's down here. It looks like the square rounded rectangle circle all in a row. Click on that, and then you're going to click and draw up, click and drag up, and then click and drag down, and that will kind of blend all of these shapes together for you. That's looking pretty good. Once you're at this point, we are going to go to Object, and we're going to click on Expand. Now, if you've never used Illustrator before, expand sounds like we're going to enlarge it, but expand actually means that we are adding a path around the edge of it. Now, expand, whenever we're using a path, that's creating a vector image. So many times, sometimes we'll have something that will look a certain way, but that actual vector will just be a single line in the middle of it. So when we expand, that'll actually, as you'll see here, we'll get the option of object and fill, which is okay. When we expand, we can see all those individual paths around the parts of our object. So this is exactly what we want to see. We can see we had our blend that kind of created this new shape in here in between our two other shapes. And now we need to combine these all into one shape, now that we can see all of the different paths. And we do that with something called the Shape Builder, aptly named. The Shape Builder looks like two circles with a little arrow. Click on that, and then if you hover in here, you'll see this little dotted pattern that shows up as your cursor follows over these different shapes. Click and drag through those shapes, and they will very quickly be united into one. Very, very simple. All right, so now at this point, we are ready to start some shading. So we are going to shade using a tool called Mesh, and the Mesh tool is right here. It looks like a little wavy mesh. Click on that, and then I'm going to just show you this because it's easier to kind of get it once you see it. So I'm going to start clicking up here in this upper left corner, and you can see now I have a vertical mesh line set, and I have a horizontal mesh line set and an intersection point. Now you can still adjust these. If you went back to the direct selection tool, you could move these around. But the great thing about Illustrator is it intuitively kind of senses where that form of your shape would be if that becomes a three-dimensional object. And it just kind of creates this mesh around it. So I'm going to do this again, and again, and again. And maybe one more time here. And really for this, I'm feeling like this is just fine, just for this demonstration. I probably am not going to be doing the amount of shading that I would probably be doing for a more in-depth project. But just to show you how the mesh works, I think this is fine. Now, for your mesh, you may want to go in and add some more, or maybe even manipulate it, go in with your direct selection tool that, or even if you do a Shift-C, you could convert some of these anchor point tools and move that around a little bit. But now what we're going to do with the mesh, because I'm pretty happy with it, is we're going to actually use it to shade. So mesh is great for shading because what it'll do is it will set these individual anchor points to a certain color, and then let's say this edge on this side is going to be darker. This darker edge will then kind of wrap into my shape and it will blend with the current color that my shape is. So let's go ahead and show what that looks like. If I hold down the Shift key and I select all of these individual anchor points, bum, bum, bum. And this does take a little while as you're going through here, but it's pretty cool once you get it. I'm going to go up to my swatches and I'm actually going to set that to a dark gray. So it looks like I had some selected over here too, but that's okay. Now if you do make a mistake though and you'd like to go back and change some of those selections, you can totally do that. You can go back and change it back to the other gray. And if you ever make a mistake that you want to step back, you can just do a Command Z and that will walk you back as well. So now I've got a pretty dark gray there. If I click again, I can start clicking through these different anchor points that are near that. And then maybe I add kind of a medium gray. And you can start to see that shade kind of wrapping around there. I can even go in and maybe in these areas where that kind of roundness comes down, I can do a little bit more of a medium gray and just kind of create a little bit more of a blend. And that just gives you a little, make sure that you're actually selected in there when you're changing these things up. There you go. Just gives you a little bit more of a kind of blended shadow. And so I would probably spend a little bit more time on this, but I'm not going to overdo it because I do want to move on and not spend all day. But if you were taking your time on this, you could really get a very nice gradual transition all the way across the skull. And that's going to be a fun way to create that nice gradual form in your drawing. Now, we have been working this whole time on one layer, and now we're going to actually create a new layer before our next part. So if you go to your layers panel, these two little squares, go ahead and click on this little square down here with the tab, and that is going to create a new layer for you. And once you have that new layer created, go ahead and lock this other layer, the one that we have our skull on currently, and we're going to do that just by clicking next to the eyeball. So there we go. Now let's draw some eye sockets. So go back to the rounded rectangle. This time we're going to choose a black, and we're going to do a little something different with the stroke. I'm going to go ahead and pull this stroke to the front, and down here at the bottom you can see we have the option of solid color, gradient, or no fill. We're currently at no fill, but let's go ahead and set it at gradient. And then we're going to go ahead and draw our eye socket. So just draw a simple rounded rectangle here. Hit A, and then you can click on these individual anchor points and just move them around. And again, if you hit Shift-C, you can actually convert these anchor points to round them a little bit more, or even to take away the roundness if you want to click on some of these to take that away. And that's looking pretty good. So when you're happy with your eye socket, then you can stop manipulating those anchor points. But we are going to go in and we're going to play a little bit with the stroke that we set up. So here you can just barely see the stroke around our shape that we drew. And the stroke, because it's a gradient, we have the white on this side and the black on this side. But we're going to kind of use this gradient to show shading. And if we had a skull where the dark shadow was on the right side, then the light on this interior object would be down in this lower corner and not up here on this side. So we need to kind of manipulate this gradient. So over here on the right, you can see our gradient panel. If you don't see this, you can go to Window and then select Gradient. And we have the option of changing the angle of that. So 90 is getting closer. Let me try maybe 120. 120 is looking really good because I have this kind of interior white here. Now that's still though very difficult to see. So now I'm going to go to my stroke panel, which is right up here. Looks like 3 lines going across. And I'm going to change the weight of that stroke. I'm going to take it up to 4 points, which is looking very deep, but then I'm going to do something else here too. If I go down to Profile, I'm going to change the width profile so it's just a little bit more organic. Even though we've got a very geometric looking skull, this just gives it a more kind of drawn look to it. It just kind of looks more fun. So you can change, you don't have to have the profile that I selected. You can experiment with some different ones. I tend to like this kind of figure 8, or it kind of looks like an ant profile. If you can't see these different options, you can click up here and click Show Options, and you should be able to see them. So if you're not seeing what I'm seeing, click up in this little drop-down menu and show the options. All right, once you're happy with this, we need to duplicate it. So we're going to go to our Selection tool, zoom out here. Hold your Option key down. Let me actually click off here and then click back. Hold your Option key down until you see those double arrows. And if you hold the Shift key after you click and start dragging, that will drag it perfectly off to the side. Now this still isn't looking great because obviously our eye sockets don't both go the same direction. So we need to go to Object, Transform, and we're going to Reflect. And when we reflect, if you click on the preview down here, you can see what's going on. I'm doing a vertical reflection, angle 90 degrees, looking good to me, so I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. Once you have this, you can hold the Shift key down, select both of those, and then just kind of arrow them into where you would like them. Now, because these are looking largely the same, what I probably want to do here is go to my stroke again. I'm going to change up that profile just a little bit so it's just a little different, and then I'm going to go back to the gradient here and I'm going to change the direction of the gradient to 120 so it kind of matches that other one and it's going across. So that's looking pretty good. Alright, so I'm going to do the same thing now with the nose cavity, and you can do this with rounded rectangle. If you want to try a different tool, you can do that too, because we will probably be manipulating that a little bit. So if I take this tool here, do a Shift C, and I can round some of these edges, and then kind of start moving these things around so it's a little bit more like a nose cavity for a skull. There we go. All right, so that's looking pretty good. All right, so now I'm going to be adding some little shading marks before we get to the mouth. And with these shading marks, we're going to be using a tool we haven't used yet, and that is our pencil tool. So I'm going to click onto my pencil tool, and I want to set my fill to 0. So I'm going to click on the fill and then click on that little red line. For my stroke, I'm just going to go ahead and set that to black, so I can just click on color and it should set to black. If it doesn't, you can go up here and select black. I'm actually going to take my point size down to 2 points, and I'm just going to do kind of the teardrop or the little football shaped stroke there. And if I look here on this side of my skull, I'm going to actually kind of use this next thing that I'll be showing you to shade. So I am going to draw a line that kind of runs along this shadow of the skull. I am then going to draw another line that kind of does that. So it kind of also runs upward to the edge of that shading area. Then I am going to select both of those lines, and I'm going to go to Object, Blend, Make, and then Object, Blend, Blend Options. So our blend options, we want to go into Specified Steps, and I'm going to select Preview here too. And I'm going to try 5 steps and see what that looks like. If you want to click back and forth here, you can kind of see the difference that that makes. And I'm going to go ahead and put it align to path because really it's not changing it at all, but align to path is fine. But as you're adding adding more numbers in here, you might want to click just back and forth because that kind of resets your preview. But either one of these would work for this, but I'm going to go ahead and align to path, which is the second one. 5 is looking fairly good to me. So if you have something that looks good, you can go ahead and hit OK. Now something interesting about when you're creating these blends, you can actually go in here and you can manipulate this path, and as I manipulate that, notice that it manipulates the entire blend. So all of those little lines are being changed as I go in here and change just one part of that. So that's looking pretty good to me. Now it's a little dark, but what I can do is I can go in here and go to my transparency panel, and I can take my transparency down a little bit so that my opacity is just lower. So that's almost acting like hatching here. It's almost like hatch marks that show you that this is just a little bit darker in that area. So if you would like to put that on the other side, you could go through the process of totally recreating it. But again, if you have your selection key, or if your selection tool is selected on this entire thing, hold down the Option key and then click and drag across. And then again, we can go to Object, Transform, and Reflect, and then hit OK because that's the same kind of reflection that we had before. So that works out just fine. Move that over, and now we've got kind of those hatch marks on the side of our skull. Looking good. All right, so let's create a new layer. And I'm going to go ahead and lock down everything we did on that last layer. And now we're going to do just a couple more things that we haven't done before. We're going to go into our shape tool again, our rounded rectangle. This time we want no fill and we want a black, or we want a black fill and no stroke. And we're going to draw a simple rounded rectangle. Boom. All right, that's looking good. Now, while we have this up, I'm going to click on the pencil tool. And now if you look down here at the bottom, notice these very bottom 3 buttons. The first one says Draw Normal, second one is Draw Behind, and the last one is Draw Inside. So we are going to draw some jaggedy teeth here, and we want to draw those so that they kind of disappear as they go along the edge of this mouth. So I'm clicking Draw Inside, and when I do that, I get these little brackets. So whatever shape you're selected on, that will create those brackets around that shape. And then in my pencil tool, I'm going to go ahead and draw my first tooth. Now, that doesn't look like anything because I need to change my fill. So I need to go up here and change that to maybe a little bit of a darker gray. There we go, something like that. And then I can continue onward. So I can do another jankily? I don't know that that's a word, but it's kind of ugly skull teeth here. Like they've just been kind of rotting away. They definitely do not need to be pretty. All right. Now, if they're looking a little too bright to you, you can go back to your direct selection tool, hold your shift key down, select the top row of these, and maybe instead of a fill, you put a gradient into those. Oops. Let's take that out. Let's go, here we go. We put a gradient in there, and let's do it so that, no. Yeah, that'll work. So if you want to kind of mix it around, you can do that. If you want to change the colors of your gradient too, you can always double click in here and maybe I make that a little bit darker. So you can change these just by double clicking in these individual little boxes. You can also kind of change how much it scales. So if you want a little bit more darkness in that, you can do that too. And change that back to 90. All right, so we're looking good there. You could do the same at the bottom. I'm going to click all of these. And we'll add a gradient in that. Need to change that so it's a little bit more in the direction that we would want it. Not 120, maybe negative. Oops, I had all of them selected. Uh-oh. Oh well. That's good enough. So once you're done with this, you have to make sure though that you click back on your regular drawing mode. Now, as you can see, you can do a Shift D to change those, but since there's 3, I'd probably just make sure you go back and click. Now, the last little thing that we need to do, other than just little final touches, is we're going to actually create a crack in the skull because most skulls are not kind of perfect without any imperfections and cracks. So we're going to take our pencil tool again, and this time we are going to set our stroke to black and just start by drawing kind of a jagged line coming from the back. Now, I'm going to take the size, the weight of that up a little bit, and I'm going to change to a different profile. I'm also going to go down here to our width tool, which you may not see because it may be hiding under any of these other tools. So if you do a Shift W, you can find it. And in some of these areas, I can just make it a little wider or a little narrower, and it just creates kind of a fun look to it. Now I could take that, after I've even sized it, take it down a little bit in size, or change to those individual parts of the width. I could take it a little bit down in size. If you like this kind of width profile too, you could even add it to your current width profiles, and that will allow you to use it again. So once you're done with that, we're going to go back to our pencil, and then we're going to add a couple other little cracks in there because it would make sense that we would have a few. Now, if they're looking a little too smooth and perfect to you, you could go in and kind of play around with the wrinkle tool a little bit. I could wrinkle up some of these. As long as you have it selected, you go back, grab a wrinkle tool again, kind of wrinkle it up, and that's kind of fun. Yay! So now we have our scary skull. Hopefully the process was not that scary, and hopefully you learned a little bit about how to combine all of your different shapes, use some hatch shading, use some gradient mesh, use a shape builder tool, create some different shadows, and just kind of have some fun. So good luck with making your own skull and have fun.